Welcome to tonight's tale. This tale is of romance, love everlasting, but it's also going to include the lovely tale of a man who could not die. Also, just for fun, I shall throw in a little bit of a haunting as well. Why not? Now for tonight's tale, we start in 1300. Now at that moment in time, Scotland's king, John Balliol, was in exile in France, and basically Scotland was without a king as a ruler. So Edward I sought his overlordship of Scotland and placed one John Seagrave as the governor of Scotland, the overseer to everything that was happening in Scotland. He was also commander of Edinburgh Castle. Now, Sir John had a liking for one Lady Margaret Ramsay of Dalhousie. Now, she did not return the favours that Sir John was giving her. You see, her heart belonged to another, that of Henry St. Clair of Rosslyn Castle. Now, Sir John tried his best. He would always visit Dalhousie Castle. He would always try and woo the fair Lady Margaret. But no matter what he tried, she rebuffed his advances. This actually got Sir John quite angry. He knew there was another, Henry St. Clair, but there was basically nothing he could do about it. Now, he was called back in 1302 to Carlisle, his main base of operations, by Edward I. Edward I was planning on visiting Scotland again with an army to subdue some of the uprisings. Now, while he was there in the latter part of 1302, he got word that Henry St. Clair and Margaret Ramsay of Dalhousie were getting married. This totally and absolutely incensed Sir John, and he wrote to Edward I demanding that he was able to raise an army and basically invade Scotland. Now, Edward I was a bit reluctant for him to do this. He would rather wait until the main body of the English army arrived. But thinking it may help the cause in some way by keeping the Scots busy, he agreed to it. And from Carlisle, Sir John was able to raise an army of around 30,000 men, and he marched them into Scotland. Now, at that time, Scotland had a great secret service. It was basically the abbots and the monks. They would actually be able to get word backwards and forwards about anything that was happening in the border region. And the abbots of Melrose quickly informed various other abbots, who eventually got to Abbotsford. And he was told that there was 30,000 men marching into Scotland, and they were coming up past Melrose. He quickly got word to the three main commanders of the Scottish army at that time: John Comyn, Simon Seymour, and of course our very own William Wallace. Now, William Wallace was asked if he wished to command the army of Scotland, and he actually refused that. He had been beaten at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, so he didn't really want to take command of the full army. Now, we only numbered about 8,000 men, and we were standing up against an army of 30,000. Now, this is where it gets to our advantage. Sir John split his army into three, 10,000 in virtually each section of it. 10,000 were sent to Dalhousie, 10,000 were sent against Rosslyn, and 10,000 were sent against Borthwick Castle. Now this gave the Scots an advantage. Instead of taking on 30,000, all they needed to do was take on three individual armies of 10,000 each. John Comyn took command of the Scottish army, and he turned around and said that the best tactic was to take on the army heading towards Rosslyn Castle first. Now this was led by Sir John. What they did was late at night in February 1303, they actually, using 2,000 men, the rest hiding in the Rosslyn Glen, in the forest around Rosslyn Glen, 2,000 men sneaked into the English camp and basically started massacring the English in their sleep. English were so disarrayed that they actually broke ranks from their sleep and raced backwards. What they didn't realise was that they were racing into the main body of the Scottish army. It was a complete and utter rout of the English. We captured round about 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners. The rest were basically massacred. Now, on hearing of the Third Army's demise and the capture of Sir John, the army that was sent towards Dalhousie wheeled about and started back towards Rosslyn. Now, to give you an idea, it's only about 4 miles between each aspect across rough terrain. Sir William Wallace was given control of the army to hold back the ones that were coming from Dalhousie. He was given control of just under 3,000 men, and he set them up on a hill called Notts Hill, which is today where the Bush Research Centre is. There is actually a stone marking the site where Sir William Wallace actually stood with his army. And he employed a tactic that he was actually an expert at. He hid most of the main body of the army in the forest areas. Some up on the trees were the archers, down in the ground were the pikemen, the skeletons. And a small body was used to lure the English into the main trap. The English fell for it, and they were completely surrounded. They had nowhere to go. They fought a fierce battle, but they were actually driven back to the river that runs through the glen. Now, it was 100-foot drop down into the river. They were pushed back so far that the bodies just kept falling over and over and over down into the burn below. And it was said that the burn actually run red with the blood of the English. It was another decisive victory for the Scots. The Scots had now fought 2 pitched battles within a 12-hour period. They were basically exhausted. They were tending to their own wounded as well as tending to the English wounded, and they had about 5,000 prisoners to try and keep watch of. It was at that moment that Abbotsford reported that the third section of the 10,000 men that was sent to Borthwick was on the march towards them, and they were heading around the road that is now from Roswell down into the Glen. Now, at this moment in time, the Scots really didn't want to fight. They were totally shattered. They had no motivation. Abbotsford stood up and gave a speech. He told them to look to the west, and there they would get a sign that God was on their side and that they would have a decisive battle. The soldiers looked to the west, and there, on the Pentland Hills was the solitaire, the Scottish flag, flying full on fire. Now this was a sign from God that they would win. They roused themselves up, they set themselves up for the third pitched battle. Before doing so, though, they actually massacred most of the actual English prisoners and only kept those of a high ranking value. The Third Army descended into the glen and they were also attacked and basically massacred within the glen itself. Of the 30,000 men that entered Scotland, less than 3,000 were able to return home, were able to escape the onslaught. The ones that were captured were held for ransom from their own kind down in England. Edward I was totally and absolutely incensed at this. The battle that he hoped would divert the Scots was lost. Rosslyn Castle, Borthwick Castle and Dalhousie Castle remained intact. Now, during the actual battle itself, a Scottish soldier killed a knight. Now, the knight had brought his wolfhound with him. His wolfhound saw the master being killed and attacked the Scotsman. The Scotsman had no option but to kill the wolfhound. Now, it is said that the ghost of the wolfhound held stake at the castle for 3 days, waiting on the Scottish soldier for leaving the castle itself. On the third day, the Scottish soldier had no option. He had to leave the castle, and he was actually attacked by the wolfhound, well, the ghost of the wolfhound. He duly escaped the attack of the ghost wolfhound and fled into the forest, leaving the wolfhound saddened at losing its prey. Now, today, it is often said down by Rosslyn Castle you will see the remnants of the wolfhound still there. Its spirit still haunts that area where it was actually killed and where its master died, which is just directly underneath the bridge that leads into the castle itself. Now, dog walkers who have actually taken their dogs down there have reported that sometimes their dogs react like there is something in front of them, and the dogs go to in front of the actual people who are taking them for the walks and protect that person, their owner. And it's also said that sometimes that the dogs, when they're passing this area, let out a mournful howl. This could be the spirit of the wolfhound interacting with the dogs that go down here. It's also said that late at night you can hear the clashing of swords and the actual sounds of battle all around you in the glen area. Men moving around, trees rattling and that. Now, there is a field down there that's known as Shinblade Field. The reason for that is when the farmer goes to plough this area, he always ploughs up actually the remains of various soldiers that were killed in the battle. Now, another little bit of history. Abbotsford is a small village on the outskirts of Rosslyn and Pennycook. It's actually in between the two of them, and this was actually named Abbott after Abbott Ford. So now it's Abbotsford. And of course, everybody knows Glencorse because that's where the army barracks is, and that's where the army train is actually in Glencorse. There's also a very nice hotel there, and a very, very nice church. And it was actually, this church sits where the flag of Scotland was seen. The St Andrew's Cross was seen on the day of the battle in 1303. And actually the area that's now Glencorse was actually known as Glen Cross, the cross on the glen. So the names that are there today relate back to the battle in 1303. And if you head down that way, and you do happen to see the wolfhound, then you know exactly where it came from. And if you head down that way and you hear the sounds of battle, you know still to this very day the man that could not die, well, that was William Wallace. He was known at that time that he was completely and utterly invincible, and only a speciality would be able to kill him. Sadly, in 1305, he was actually captured by Edward I and taken down to London, where something special did happen to him. He was hung, drawn, and quartered. But today, you never know. You may catch sight of his ghost at Knott Hill. You may capture the sound of his voice in battle at Rosslyn Glen.